Okay, so the basic structure of cell membrane is made by molecules called phospholipids and proteins. What is a phospholipid? Phospholipid is a class of lipid which happens to have a polar phosphate head, and it also has two non-polar hydrocarbon chains. What does that imply? Well, it simply means that let's take water for example. Let me draw a water molecule. Water molecule is a polar molecule, which means that it has difference of charges. So the hydrogens are slightly positive, whereas the oxygens are slightly negative. Now, what this implies is that other water molecules are attracted to each other. This is what implies. So if we take so basically if we take two phospholipid molecules, their heads, the polar heads, would attract. Their polar heads will attract, or or we could also say that their tails would attract because they're similar in nature. So that is basically what happens. If you put a particular or if you put some phospholipids in water, let's say this is a container and you put phospholipid in a water, there are a few possibilities. Well, one is that they would stand upright because this is a polar, this, let's say it has negative charge. So these polar molecules, the polar head would be attracted to the water, whereas these tails would be repelled by the water, or they could form a ball. They could form a ball with the heads outside, but the tails inside. The tails inside, or they could form a phospholipid bilayer. Let me draw a bilayer real quick. So when this happens, the water there is the water molecules are outside the bilayer, and are attracted to the polar heads, whereas there is no water between the non-polar hydrocarbon chains. So that is the basic structure of cell membrane. This is the phospholipid phospholipid bilayer. Now the other components are proteins, but the proteins are actually segregated into two categories. One is called extrinsic proteins, which are outside the cell membrane, or inside, which are basically not part of the lipid bilayer. They are not in the lipid bilayer. So these the blue ones are extrinsic proteins, whereas the yellow ones are called intrinsic protein. They can be full span proteins like this one is, or there can be half spanning proteins like these two are. Now, the last structure that the phospholipid bilayer is made of are called cholesterol molecules. These are these are cholesterol molecules, small green. And the interesting thing about cholesterol is that it also has a polar head and a non-polar tail. So it actually helps to bind phospholipid molecules together, and it maintains the fluidity of the cell membrane. Now, what other thing? Okay, so yeah, so actually in reality, these protein molecules that are embedded within the phospholipid bilayer, they are not static. They are constantly moving around. So this type of model of of cell membrane is called fluid mosaic model. Why is that so? Well, fluid because none of these components, which is it might be either these proteins or these phospholipids, they are not static. They are constantly moving around in in x direction, x positive, x negative, and z direction towards out of the board and into the board. Okay, and same goes for these protein molecules. So the cell membrane is said to be fluid. Now, it's also said to be mosaic because these proteins are embedded are in if you've ever seen a tile, a mosaic tile, what it is that different stones are embedded on the tile, and you can kind of think like you can kind of think this whole canvas as phospholipid, whereas these different dots as proteins. So that's where the mosaic word comes from. It's because these proteins are randomly embedded in the cell membrane. So the most important takeaway from this lecture is that the cell membrane is fluid in nature, and it is described as fluid mosaic. Okay,